We might begin. I'd like to welcome everyone to Tara Institute this evening. And I'm going to be commencing the session, as previous sessions, with a meditation upon the breath. And before doing that, I just wanted to mention a couple of key points about the mind. And I realise that Damien touched upon some of these on the first Monday of the month, which unfortunately I missed because I was ill. So for those who weren't here, I'm going to quickly recapitulate, but also stress a few of the key aspects. So I want to ask the really alarmingly obvious question, what is the mind? And the moment that question's raised, we start to flounder. Perhaps we come up with all sorts of ideas. Buddhism is going to propose a radically simple and actually very robust definition. Buddhism says that the reigning or sort of prevailing characteristics of the mind are clarity, we've got clarity, and cognition. So clarity is referring to the fact that the mind has no physical attributes, such as colour, texture, shape, density, weight, velocity, etc. Any of the qualities that we normally ascribe to physically tangible things. And although I haven't got time to develop this topic at all, other than to touch upon it, this is where Western science and Buddhism are going to have a debate. Because when a Western scientist measures brain waves and electrical magnetic sort of patterns using electrodes connected to the brain, Buddhism is going to say that that's not measuring consciousness itself. It's measuring a physiological activity which isn't itself mind. It may be connected to mind, particularly with gross levels of mind, so it's not that it's an unrelated activity, but it can't be reduced to the mind itself. So this is a really, really important point. Clarity, which is the other component, refers to the fact that when this mind touches or contacts certain phenomena, things, it is able to reflect them in the same way that a mirror can reflect its objects. Due to the quality of cognizance, in other words, the mind can engage or cognize that object that's appearing to it. And again, this is startling in its sort of radical simplicity. And it really goes without saying, but the moment we begin to meditate, we begin to see the impact of that definition, because we have constant appearances occurring to our mind, even when we're turning the mind inside rather than operating through the senses. So cognition is a conscious faculty of apprehension that functions in seeing forms, such as this is a form, sounds, tastes, tactile sensations, etc. Anything through the senses, but it also can reflect internal mental activity, such as thought. The other crucial aspect of the mind is that it is a continuum. One moment of mind flows into the next without a break. And that's really evident when we think that this mind that I currently have at the moment that's cognising Ross giving a presentation or the beginning of one in a gompa, prayer hall, is connected to my own mind of yesterday, which is connected to my own mind of last year, which is connected to my own mind of the little baby Ross, even before that little baby Ross was named Ross. So Buddhism is going to propose in a very, very stimulating way that this continuum of mind extends before the mind of this lifetime and beyond the mind of this lifetime. So that's on that basis that Buddhism proposes reincarnation and death as, sounds a bit like a science fiction thriller, body swapping, if we have the karma to take on another physical body. Buddhism presents some rebirth states where we only have a mental state of existence without a gross physical body. So the mind is a continuum, and my continuum is unique to me, just as your mental continuum, or mind stream as we call it, is unique to you. They're not interchangeable, nor can they merge. So in Buddhism we're not searching for a kind of oceanic absorption into a cosmic fountainhead of consciousness in which all of our individual sort of notions of existence and so forth will dissolve like sugar into a giant bucket of water to diffuse through it. That doesn't happen. But this particular mind has enormous potential, just as each of our mind has, for limitless development. So the process of striving towards enlightenment from a Buddhist perspective involves a process of thinning and removing the delusions and obstructing forces, if you like, which cloud our mental potential. So as I mentioned on the second night, Buddhism proposes that so-called afflictions such as anger, attachment and so forth are adventitious. It's a tricky word, but there's really no other way of saying it better. It's pointing to the fact that those things are temporary and they'll be present for as long as the causes and conditions for those states are operative. So the classic example here, of course, is that one moment of mind, such as my current angry mind, tomorrow might be completely not angry. It's still the same mind stream, but it's no longer being coloured or affected or even weighed down by the obscuring mind of anger. So Buddhism is going to propose in a radically optimistic fashion, you'll be glad to hear, that, as I mentioned last week, positive states of mind which are based on a valid apprehension of reality, and fortunately minds like love and compassion are to be included in those, can be developed limitlessly, whereas afflicted minds such as anger, hatred and so forth, even though they can be very, very powerful, particularly in a short space of time, can only ever be developed in a limited fashion. So this is something to be explored. So a mind that is flooded with disturbing emotions can become one that is peaceful and joyful. This is the Buddhist proposition. In order to generate that peaceful and joyful mind, we have to begin to work with the nitty-gritty of the causes and conditions for the arising of particular, what we call secondary mental states. So the main mind has clear cognition, and within that we have what we call secondary minds. It's not that they're separate, it's just referring to those sorts of aspects that appear within that luminous cognizant space, such as an emotion. An emotion rises like a wave within consciousness, cognition, has a duration and dissolves. We can actually develop tactics for exploring that in meditation. So His Holiness the Dalai Lama observes The mind may be coloured by different emotions at different times. Anger and loving kindness are opposite. They cannot manifest at the same time. This is very interesting. Although they may arise at different times. I'm going to be provocative, and I'm going to be provocative a little bit tonight. His Holiness goes on, even people such as Hitler and Stalin, who had great hatred, felt love for their family members and children. The fact that the mind can be dominated by anger at one time and by an opposite emotion, such as love, at another, indicates that the emotions are not the nature of the mind. The mind is pure. It is like colourless water that can be coloured by a variety of hues or none at all. So I'm just going to quote now from a book that I've been reading. It's about 600 pages, and it's quite gruelling in many ways, but it's also extremely interesting. It's called Is This a Woman? Someone read it? Is This a Woman? Inside Ravensbrück, Hitler's Concentration Camp for Women by Sarah Helm. And I just want you to contemplate this little story that she tells. Langefeld's replacement as chief guard was the 23-year-old Austrian Maria Mandl, whose position as chief guard of the bunker went to Dorothea Bintz. Mandl loved to interfere. Her special amusement at roll call was to hunt for curls. She would stride slowly along the ranks, inspecting heads, and if she found a curly lock, she would beat the woman around the head or kick her to the ground. Or, depending on her mood, she sent the offender to be shaved and then made her parade in front of others, with a placard hanging from her neck which said, "I broke the rules and curled my hair." Maria Belika saw Mandl kick a Jewish woman to death at roll call. She had done something wrong and she was first slapped, then kicked. But a strange thing happened after that. I had a friend who had a job cleaning in the guards' hostels. One of the senior guards had a piano in her room. One day my friend went in and heard the most beautiful music. The woman who was playing was lost in a world of her own, in ecstasy. It was the same guard who had murdered the Jewish woman a few days earlier. So how are we to navigate this scene in which Maria Mandl passes from torturing sadist to an exquisite pianist in what is effectively a matter of moments? How do we think of how the Jewish inmates appear to her at the time she is abusing them, in contrast to her rapt apprehension and sensual immersion in the musical notes she magically and beautifully spins from the piano? How is one person able to make this transition at all? It's worth noting here that many of the women in this Ravensbrück camp were political prisoners, particularly those who were feminist and those who were socialist and those who were feminist socialists. Also gypsies, prostitutes, doctors, opera singers, pregnant single mothers, lesbians, etc. A cohesive fraternity of social undesirables from a patriarchal Nazi perspective. Now, relating this back to ourselves, we also have a potential to injure even those we dearly love, if in a fit of rage, spite, or hurt. Or to turn away from a friend in need, thus effectively rendering them a stranger, rubbing them out, as it were, together with their need. The artist Christian Boltanski, does anyone know Christian Boltanski's work here? He's a Jewish Algerian artist, and he's done some quite remarkable bodies of work to do with remembering the Holocaust. And he did a series based on reclaimed photos, family photo albums of German soldiers celebrating with their families ordinary events such as Christmas, birthdays, and weddings. The catch was those photos had all been taken by soldiers who were also involved in the daily running of the concentration camps. So they were making the transition from the concentration camp, where people were being fed literally into the gas chambers or the furnaces, back to the loving embrace of their families to celebrate even their young son or daughter's birthday with a wedding cake and a party. So there's a very, very important writer called Gita Serini, some of us will have read her work, I'm sure, who wrote on the Holocaust, and she tells an incredibly moving story of a capo, a Jewish man who had been appointed, as was the custom of the German officials, to help operate the concentration camp. Something like 80% of the people operating the concentration camps were actually recruited inmates. And they were recruited under incredible pressure, so much so that the Israeli government has not ever pressed any war crimes against capos, because it's recognised that people, any ordinary so-called person under extreme duress, is capable of doing extraordinary, unimaginable things. On this occasion, this particular man was sorting clothes that had been taken off the people who were going to be going to their death. And he'd been doing that for a number of days, relatively successfully. I mean, he could actually operate. And he suddenly fell forward as though he'd been stabbed. And the reason was he had recognised a yellow tunic, which was the same as the one worn by his own daughter. And at that moment, he could not function anymore. So this is a kind of replay in reverse of Christian Boltanski's construction of somehow radical dissonance, where you cut off so dramatically from the implications of your actions that you can run what appears to be a normal life with impunity without any moral kind of weight or implication. Here is someone who was under incredible duress, attempting to function in order to survive, but the moment they recognised that it wasn't an anonymous project or process in which they were engaged, i.e. their own child's life was at stake, they were suddenly pierced to the very core and could no longer function. So these are really dramatic examples I've raised, and they're startling and shocking, and probably in some important ways disturbing. But a little bit later we're going to do a friend, enemy and stranger meditation, which is tackling some of these issues from a kind of cognitive, experiential viewpoint, and we'll begin to see perhaps more clearly how each of us in every moment is effectively having to make ethical decisions about how we respond to others, and ourselves for that matter. It's never remote from the lived moment. So part of the challenge of meditation isn't just to feel peaceful and kind of benign. It's to get into the very depths of the way in which we construct realities that compartmentalise, fracture and dislocate us in powerful ways from not just the reality of what's around us, but from our sense of responsibility for what's around us. What is our own agency, in other words? So Buddhism is going to look at this in a very productive way again, because it's going to say that if I can cut through the burden of my very heavy afflicted states of mind, such as anger and so forth, and develop their opposite states of mind, as His Holiness has mentioned, love and compassion, my ability to see, and I'm talking here in the sort of general first person, our ability to see what's in front of us and how best to respond is immediately apparent. So wisdom and compassion work hand in hand. This is the great aim. We see exactly what can be done and how to do it. So this is a theme we'll look at a little bit more. Having said all that, it's very good to be able to just simply step out of the busyness of our lives and relax a little, to give ourselves the space to even begin to think of realigning or refocusing in the ways that I'm explaining. So we're going to commence with a breathing meditation, and then after that I'm going to say a few more words, and we're going to then do the friend, enemy and stranger meditation. So that's the introduction to the meditation. So we're going to now become aware of our situation just as it is, on our spot, here, right now, this instant. So bring the mind into the room, into the body, into the present moment. And now for a few in and out breaths, let go of any tension, agitation, pain, whatever. With the out breath, just letting it dissolve into the space in front. Then, with the immediate in-breath, radiant light pours into the body and the mind, bringing calmness, soothing, relaxed states of mind. So just work with our own condition. If we've been obsessed by a particular problem or worry, of course we let this go and breathe in its opposite, an unworried, open mind. Now we shape a motivation for the meditation ahead, thinking how wonderful it would be if all beings without exception had happiness. Feel this from the depths of our heart. How wonderful it would be if all beings without exception were freed of suffering and its causes. Again, feel this from the heart. How wonderful it would be if all beings without exception abided in equanimity, free from holding some close and others distant. How wonderful it would be if all beings without exception achieved only high rebirths and the supreme bliss of liberation. This is a great, enduring happiness, in other words, not just a momentary peacefulness. May these 4 aspirations come about. May I be able to help them come about. Please, Buddha, bless me that this might be so. And here we can substitute any other source of inspiration for the Buddha, depending on our own religious or philosophical or humanist position. It's irrelevant. It's the intensity of the aspiration that counts. And with that motivation in place, we now become aware of the mind, that which is able to ascertain its object clearly. And we place this upon awareness of the breath as it flows in and out through the nose or through the mouth, depending. Following the breath a little in and a little out, not letting go of contact of awareness with the flow of the breath for even 1 microsecond. So we just let the breath find its own rhythm, its own momentum. Just relax onto the breath. Wherever the breath goes, our awareness goes. If we're finding the mind's chattering, this is a distraction. Let go of the distraction and return to awareness of the breath. Sometimes the mind sets up daydreaming, fantasies, stories. These are all distractions. Acknowledge them as such and return to awareness of the breath. If we're feeling restless or fidgety, even in our body, this is a distraction. Acknowledge and return to bare, direct awareness of the breath. This is our object of observation. Just checking, where is our awareness on the breath? Checking. So for the last few moments of the meditation, see if we can enhance the quality of our awareness, being aware of the breath more vividly, more precisely. Now we can let go of the breath as our main object, quietly becoming aware of our body. And just resting with that awareness of the body for a few moments. Then we can become aware again of the room, our environment. We can relax our meditation postures. So for the effective terms of this particular meditation, any appearance to the mind which isn't the breath, awareness of the breath, is a distraction. So the mind will conjure an endless stream of appearances. They can be the sensation of my kneecap, they can be the pressure of my socks against my ankle. It can be a thought of what I did yesterday. It can be thinking, where did I leave my car keys? Do I have to pay my mortgage before 12 o'clock tonight in order not to get fined, etc., etc., etc. Some of these are very compelling and demanding. Other ones seem quite trivial, but they all have this capacity to make us forget our meditation object. So we have to be absolutely thorough and unsentimental about dropping and returning to our meditation object. The moment we accept following an appearance, we are falling into the story of that particular appearance, and we will be led wherever it wants to go. So we can even spend 10 minutes appearing to be meditating, because we're in the posture, but our mind is nowhere near our meditation object. So we're pretending to meditate to ourselves. We have the outer semblance of meditation, but we're not actually engaged in meditation. It's actually possible to have the opposite being true, that if we have this capacity to be aware of our meditation object, then we mightn't even look like we're meditating. We're still able to keep our mind on our chosen object. That's the essential thing. So it's recommended that we do a meditation of this nature on a daily basis, and it's often recommended that we do a session in the morning and a session in the evening, and maybe only for 5 or 10 minutes a session. If we're too heroic, we fall over ourselves and collapse after several days or even several weeks. If we're a little bit more energetic, we'll abandon our meditation practice. There are plenty of people, I'm sure, in this room who have abandoned their meditation practice from time to time. And curiously and rather ridiculously, we often abandon our meditation practice when we're under pressure from other things, because it seems too hard to meditate when we're stressed. But that's kind of a little bit loopy, because that's exactly when we should be meditating. Another thing I often hear is, oh, I'm too busy to meditate. Well, hey, if you're too busy to carve out an exquisitely precious 5 or 10 minute slot twice a day, then you need to sit down and have a really deep investigation of how you're conducting your affairs, because they're in a mess. And you're going to fall over exhausted or even dead. So there's no excuse. And a lot of us have busy commitments, family commitments in particular, children clamouring for attention, pets clamouring for attention, time demands of all sorts. Again, we have to make some really determined inner decisions that, yes, I do have those pressures, but I am now going to sit and do my meditation. So it's very, very important. So are there any questions or observations about the technique? I think most of, yes, go ahead.
When you're dreaming,
Yeah, yeah.
has the mind doing that when you're asleep?
It's interesting, isn't it? Buddhism's, the question is, how is the mind doing what it's doing when we're dreaming, when we're asleep? Because I've just defined the mind as a form of cognizance, which implies that it's sort of conscious apprehension of its object. Buddhism is going to quite happily say that a dreaming mind is apprehending a dream object. And that dreaming mind is a more subtle mind than our awakening consciousness. It's still cognizant, but it's cognizant of other objects that are much more subtle. So Buddhism is going to go even further and say that there are even more subtle states of mind than the dreaming mind. And the most subtle, ordinary state of mind is called the mind of clear light. And that's an apprehension directly of the sheer nature of cognizant clarity that is consciousness itself. And it's possible to take that as our meditation object, as our main meditation object. So someone who has that capacity to meditate on the bare, luminous nature of the ordinary mind will then have the capacity, seems remarkably, to be aware of themselves in a dreaming state. And so I think this got caught up in the New Age movement in the 80s. They started to talk about creative dream. Remember that creative dreaming movement? Lucid dreaming. Buddhism has all of these techniques, very, very accurately and interestingly described. And it's said to be, in many interesting ways, a very valuable thing to be able to do, to use the state of dreaming as a kind of terrain for transformation of one's self-appearance in particular. Another thing that's quite fascinating is that dreams do illustrate, don't they, an extraordinary capacity we have to visualise. Some people, when we do a visualisation meditation, say, oh, I can't visualise, I can't do this meditation. But I say, can you dream? Yes, they can dream, or therefore you can visualise. So part of our training as a meditator is to become more sensitive to these more subtle states of mind, so we can begin to explore and utilise them in meditation. So it's a journey of exploration involved. So these are great examples. Yeah, thank you. So the Buddhist challenge is to become aware or mindful of thoughts and situations as they arise. Our habitual tendency or compulsion is to be constrained or even driven by notions that effectively tie us up and prevent us from being open to experience. Even on a linguistic level, Robert J. Lifton says that we allow ourselves to become linguistically impoverished. What on earth is he talking about? In other words, we allow ourselves to have a limited repertoire of responses to events that we also tend to compulsively replay. We become embedded, in other words, in our own preconceptions, and we accept the assumptions that we have about things as a legitimate explanation of the way they actually are. So Lifton refers to this tendency, if you like, as a process of indulging in thought-terminating cliches. Cliches that terminate our thinking process effectively. So I'm going to give some examples of this tendency, and I'm not being judgmental here, I'm just trying to become descriptive of this sort of capacity we have to shut down the open nature of an encounter or an experience using a kind of pre-configured cliche little mechanism which then gets flown out to obliterate what's in front of us. Grief. My first husband died of cancer when he was 35 and I was 26, recounted Patrice Werner. I still recoil when I think of the number of people who said, "You're young, you'll find someone else." These are all different examples. My only child, Jessie, committed suicide at the age of 30. Valerie Cohen recalled, a friend wrote, I know exactly how you feel because my dog just died. After our daughter was stillborn, wrote Wendy Thomas, a colleague told me that I shouldn't have used the photocopy machine. I'm sorry for your loss to lung cancer. Did he smoke? Or, I heard your sister died of a heart attack. Was she obese? Or, heard in a support group for grieving parents, God never gives you more than you can handle. Or, she's in a better place now, it's God's plan. Or, a Buddhist retort of a similar nature, I'm sorry to hear you have cancer, but what a wonderful opportunity to purify negative karma. Or one that occurred a couple of weeks ago to myself, someone had asked me how I was, and I was explaining, oh yes, I've been quite sick. My immune system doesn't function properly since the stem cell transplant, so I feel fragile. And my friend replied, oh well, we're all going to die anyway. I remained speechless. I remained speechless because my story, my account, was rubbed out. It was obliterated by that generic response. So again, I'm not pointing the finger. I'm capable of generic responses too. I've got my own versions of these stories. I sometimes catch myself doing it even though it's already too late. And I do it in relation to myself as well, because I don't always have a good self-esteem. And sometimes someone says, oh, you can do something, and before I know it, I've said, I know I can't do that. I've already defeated my ability to do something before I've even had a chance to look at what was being offered as a project in which I might be involved. I'd already shut the situation down. So this is what I meant by a thought-terminating cliche. So what I'm going to now suggest is that thought-terminating cliches block us from an apprehension of the peculiarities of situations, the incredible specificity involved in our actual encounters with others, particularly. So it's the particularity of our lived life that matters. So when Buddhism says we have to love all beings as though they were as dear as our mother, it's not proposing that we have this kind of universal love in which everyone's swept up like leaves. It's that whenever we encounter another person, we immediately relate to them with loving concern, no matter what they're presenting to us or what's appearing to us. This is an incredible proposition, and this is what's really at the heart of the friend, enemy and stranger meditation. So I just want to quote Kim Peek. Some people know Kim Peek, I'm sure. He was the Rain Man. Do you remember the Rain Man? Dustin Hoffman. He said rather wonderfully and remarkably, you don't have to be handicapped to be different, because everybody is different. So any bid to generate equanimity, which is the purpose of a friend, enemy and stranger meditation, must be generated upon the basis of recognising the precise individuality of the people with whom we engage. To do otherwise is to sentimentalise, kind of sweep the situation up so that it accords with our ego expectation of the way the situation should be. So that's something to think about. So I'm just going to tell another story and then we're going to do the meditation. I want to say a story. This is a true account. And it is very pertinent to the meditation, Friend, Enemy and Stranger, because I want us to think about how come this particular account of a mother's grief can be not acknowledged fully, or has been since the stolen generation, but there's a huge project there of how do we begin to embrace the responsibility of not acknowledging some people in our community. And the stolen generation is the epitome of removing people who have no face, no identity, no rights, etc., even from their own mothers. So I'm going to quote from Margaret Tucker's If Everyone Cared. Margaret Tucker was one of those New South Wales Aboriginal children and adolescents who had been seized by the state authorities and prepared for an apprenticeship as a domestic servant or a rural labourer according to the demands of the Aboriginal Protection Board, which sort of was started operating that way in 1915. And Robert Mann points out this incident, and he says, gives the background. The police had arrived at Tucker's school and arrested her, this is Margaret when she's little, arrested her and her sister. Their grief-stricken mother had rushed to the school and begged for mercy. She'd been allowed to accompany her daughters part of the way. And then, writes Margaret Tucker, I heard years later how, after watching us go out of her life, she, i.e. my mother, wandered away from the police station 3 miles along the road leading out to Munukula. She was worn out with no food, no money, her apron still on. She wandered off the road to rest in the long grass under a tree. This is where old uncle and aunt found her the next day. They found our mother still moaning and crying. They heard the sounds and thought it was an animal in pain. So, compassion and love must proceed with eyes wide open. For this we need wisdom combined with compassion, and analytical meditation is one tool that we can employ to begin to generate that fusion. And a very, very important example of an analytical meditation is Friend, Enemy and Stranger, which we're now going to do together. So this is going to involve visualising, and the processes are embedded in the description which I'll give as I lead the meditation. So the purpose of the meditation is to create a smooth ground upon which to generate a loving, compassionate attitude embracing all beings. So contemplate in the space in front of us a friend, an actual friend, our friend. Bring the visualization to life, as though they were actually here. Feel that they're here. How does contemplating our friend make us feel? What feelings arise, in other words, as we contemplate our friend? What do we want to do for our friend? What are we prepared to do for our friend? So again, relate this to our actual life, situations, lived situations. What are the causes or cause of our friendship? When did it begin? How did it begin? Why did it begin? So trace back. And now contemplate if our friend was in distress or in pain, what would we feel we need to do? So see if we can draw some conclusion. What epitomizes or captures the essence of our relationship to this person, our friend? Now, place this person, our friend, to one side, and in the space in front, visualize an enemy. Our enemy. Some of us are going to say, I don't have enemies. But for the purpose of this meditation, it's our least liked person. That person whom, if they enter the room, causes our heart to fall, our demeanour to collapse, and perhaps we start looking for doorways or windows to climb out of to avoid contact with them. So again, this is a real person, someone we have real difficulty being with or around. Create them in the space in front as though they are actually here, right now, with the same immediacy and directness that we conjured the friend. And again, what distinct qualities are involved in apprehending our enemy? How do they make us feel? What do we wish to do with these feelings, or even this person? And how do we respond when this person is in pain or trouble? Again, we might find actual examples, incidents. Now, place this person to the other side, and in the space in front, visualize a stranger. In the same manner as we did the friend and the enemy. This isn't an abstract stranger. It's just someone we don't yet know. Perhaps the person who serves us at the local coffee shop. Maybe they've given us many coffees over a number of months, but we still don't know their name. So pick an actual stranger. And again explore how contemplating this person makes us feel. What emotions are involved? Are there distinct feelings in relation to them as there were with the friend and the enemy? Or is it characterized differently? Draw some conclusions. Now, bring the three together and moving from one to the next, backwards and forwards in various combinations. See what happens to our emotional responses that were defined or predicted earlier in the meditation. Are we able to sustain them under these circumstances of contemplating all three simultaneously? So we can test this out more thoroughly by contemplating. Definitely there was a moment when our friend was a stranger. That was before we befriended them, in other words. This is definite. Likewise, there can be a moment when our dearest friend becomes a stranger or an enemy. Divorce is a classic example of this procedure, or maybe. If you think of the stranger, they can be recruited for either friend or enemy, depending on other circumstances. So, these three categories are fluid, changeable. Our friend of one moment can be the enemy or the stranger of the next, in every combination, not just in one lifetime, but across lifetimes. Just as we can be the friend, enemy or stranger in someone else's meditation, depending on circumstances. So we can conclude the meditation by thinking that each of these three has the same wish to be happy and not to suffer, as we do. On that basis, there's no grounds whatsoever for discriminating between friend, enemy and stranger, holding some close and others distant. And with that we conclude the meditation. So that's the sort of encapsulated framework for the meditation, but it's not something you do once. You don't sort of say, oh, so I did that last Monday. It was good. And that's it, because that's not what we're talking about here. What I'm asking us to do is next time we have a rip-roaring fight with someone, like a real fight, a Barney, and perhaps with a loved one, because often with the closest people that we have the most intense battles, take them as the object in our meditation and sit down and work with it. Say you've got an estranged friend, someone who's fallen out of favour. It's often for the most extraordinarily trivial reason. They forgot a Christmas present on one occasion, never forgiven. We've all got aunts or uncles in that category, I'm sure. Pick them for our meditation. So the goal of the meditation is not to end up with a kind of bland, inert neutrality in relation to those three, but it's to try to rescue those three as equally the object of a legitimate concern for their well-being. So the friend category, if we look at it a little bit more deeply, is actually the one that we need to then enhance and spread to the others. We have to befriend the stranger and even befriend the enemy. And in order to do this, we need to be able to distance or detach love from attachment. So going back to the Margaret Tucker story, which I think we'll all agree is a heartbreaking account of a mother losing access to her own children, having the children robbed, really torn away. It's kind of mind-boggling that a government could even consider doing that en masse, the way that happened. So this idea of friend, enemy and stranger meditation, we have to look at in incredibly detailed, intimate terms, but we also have to look at it in terms of a more broad cultural mechanism as well. So I just wanted to touch, I have to look at time, but I'm conscious at the moment, I was looking for examples of bestrangering, if you like, and thinking, where am I going to find some examples? And it struck me that at the moment we've got a Royal Commission into nursing homes. And when the Tibetan Lamas arrived, this was happening in the 80s, first arrived in Australia, they're often taken to Chadstone as an outing. So from India to Chadstone, that's the reason they'd come, was to shop. And on one occasion, one of my teachers remarked, "Where are the old people?" For him, they were missing from our culture. Where were they? A lot of them were in nursing homes. So the conditions, I don't need to go on much, do I? But the conditions for care of the elderly in nursing homes, as we've discovered with the Royal Commission, in many ways is atrocious. Absolutely mind-bogglingly atrocious. A camera hidden in a room of a Melbourne nursing home resident suffering from Parkinson's disease has recorded ill treatment by staff, including him being yelled at, berated, dropped from a lifting machine and being left unattended despite him being unresponsive. In short, in summary, staff handling Mr. Ugg, because this was one of the testimonials at the Commission, handing roughly of staff berating him, telling him to get his damn legs back in bed, saying, "I'm sick to death of this," Mr. Bolster told the Commission, saying, "I'm not a slave," this is the carer, "I'm not a slave. It's bloody 11 o'clock, everyone is asleep and you keep getting up. It's more important, I've got more important things to worry about than your feet. Don't talk to me anymore." So staff spoke to this man as though he was a child. They even refused to assist him going to the toilet. Staff told him to stop moving, even though he has Parkinson's disease, saying, "For goodness sake, stop this fidgeting." Staff putting him to bed at 2:40 in the afternoon when he was clearly awake, and then telling him he was to stay in bed for another hour. Mr. Bolster described an incident last November when, at 7:30 a.m, Mr. Ugg collapsed as he was being helped to stand up with the support of a lifting machine. The staff lifted him up by the shirt to the bed, tapped his face, called his name, asked if he was all right, put him back to bed, changed his continent pad and turned him. No other staff attended to assist Mr. Ugg's condition for the rest of the day. So I've just got the words here in my notes, issue of chemical restraint, but I'm not going to develop it other than to say our own nursing homes are using chemical restraints to save on the economic costs of looking after the elderly in those facilities. So where do we draw boundaries? Where do we draw our ethical orbit in terms of responsibility for what's happening in our own culture this very minute in terms of friend, enemy and stranger? So it's a provocative ending for a calm, relaxing Monday night meditation. So thanks everyone. And we have tea and coffee in the diner.